Today on episode number 937 of the School of Podcasting, it's the last week of the month, which means it's question of the month. And this month I asked, what is your favorite book that you have read or listened to more than once? And if you're thinking, what does that have to do with podcasting? I'll explain that in just a second. Right now, it's time to start the show.
The School of Podcasting with Dave Jackson.
Podcasting since 2005, I am your award-winning Hall of Fame podcast coach, Dave Jackson. Thanking you so much for tuning in. If you're new to the show, this is where I help you plan, launch, grow, and if you want to monetize your podcast, my website, schoolofpodcasting.com. Use the coupon code LISTENER when you sign up for either a monthly or yearly subscription, and of course that comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee. And you're like, Dave, you just said plan, launch, grow, monetize. What do books have to do with that? Well, one of the things I wanted to point out is there are times when I run into clients and they're like, I'm kind of running out of ideas. And so we'll talk about what are they currently using, and maybe they're getting questions from Reddit or Facebook, or maybe they're certain websites they visit or TV shows or movies or whatever. And the one I rarely hear is books. And when I hear somebody talk about a book they love, that is the ultimate word of mouth. And when I hear somebody read it more than once, I was like, huh. And so, I wanted to make the point that it's good to either listen or read books because it gives you a different input. And the nice thing about a book versus a podcast is we've all heard those podcasts where at the end of it, you go, that was 20 minutes of my life I can't get back. A book is typically something that somebody put some thought into it. I know my book, Profit from Your Podcast, went through 5 different revisions of edits, and so it's usually succinct. It does drive me nuts, though, when the first chapter is, here's what we're going to talk about in chapter 1. And I'm like, if you would quit telling me what's coming, we can actually get to just chapter 1. But it is something. Right now, I'm listening to Coach Builder by Don Miller, and I will say the first 3 chapters didn't do a lot for me, but I love Don Miller. I love Story Brand. I kept pushing through, and we're getting to the good stuff, but I am going to throw in just a quick tangent here.
Oh, for crying out loud, here comes another 10-second tangent. 10 seconds indeed. Such absolute rubbish.
If you're a regular listener to the show, you know I always say when it comes time to build an audience, how long does it take to build a, decent size audience? I will say, well, I hear a lot of people say 3 years, and here's another one.
In my experience, any change in career direction takes about 3 years to metabolize one's identity.
And that is from the book Coach Builder by Donald Miller. And if you listen to the show, your podcast website, you're going to hear me mention 6 sections of a front page for your website. And that also is from the book Coach Builder. So my point is, if you're having a hard time coming up with topics or something to inspire you to come up with new topics, sometimes a book isn't such a bad idea. I know here in Akron, Ohio, there is a website called Libby. I'll put a link to that out at schoolofpodcasting.com/937. And that ties into my local library, and I can listen to audiobooks for free. And then there's another one called Hoopla Digital that kind of does the same thing. And of course, I'm not a big fan of Spotify typically, although as a listening platform, not for podcasts, for music, I love them. And they recently, if you're a paid member, have audiobooks there. And of course, the granddaddy of them all, Audible, is something I have had a membership since 2007. So I like books. Now, the other reason why I asked this question, just to peel back the curtain just a little bit, is by understanding what you read, I get insights into my audience. Like if you ever do a survey, one of the things you want to ask is what other podcasts do you listen to? Because if they're similar to yours, you might want to network with those people. And if they're not, you get insights into your audience, because the more you know about your audience, the better the content you create that's going to fit them. So with that, I asked you again, what is a book that you've read more than once and why? And this one came with a little production thrown in.
Breaking news. Dave Jackson, famed podcast educator, posed an interesting question. What's your favorite book that you've read or listened to multiple times? Hi, my name is Zoe Richardson, host of Backlook Cinema, the podcast, where we take a look back at the movies of yesteryear from the latter half of the 1900s. You can find us at www.backlookcinema.com. That's actually a very difficult question for me to answer, as I've read and listened to multiple books multiple times. It's hard to choose a favorite. But if you force me into a corner, I'm going to go with Old Man's War, written by John Scalzi. It's an epic sci-fi story that poses the question, if you were an old man and you had a chance to be young again, physically and mentally young again, would you take it? In Old Man's War, senior citizens have an opportunity to be young again. The trade-off is that they must serve in the military for 2 to 5 years, fighting in unceasing wars with a high probability of death. But if they survive, they get to keep their new bodies. I've read this book multiple times. It has provided me with hours of enjoyment, and that's my answer. That's all I have for today. Be well.
Thank you so much. I always say you want to make people laugh, cry, think, grow, and educate or entertain. And that kind of book makes you think.
Hey, Dave, this is Jay Hall from the Okie Bookcast, a podcast committed to connecting curious readers with their next great read. So your question this month is perfect for me. One of my favorite books is Bird by Anne Lamott. It's a book about writing, which I think is a skill that most of us in podcasting can use in our work, but it's also a book about creativity and about life in general. Lamott is funny, she's honest, and she's not afraid to call out nonsense for what it is. I probably listen to it once every couple of years and find it challenging and encouraging every single time. I cannot recommend it highly enough. If you're a reader looking for bookish conversations and tons of recommendations and reviews, check out the Okie Bookcast. You can find everything we have to offer at okiebookcast.com. Dave, thanks for everything you do with podcasters. Now go find something good to read.
Thank you, Jay. I explained to Jay that my dad was an Okie from Muskogee, and he said that makes you an honorary Okie. So there you go. Learned something else today.
Hey, John Finkelder here from Grow a Healthy Church. Crucial Conversations is my favorite book that I've read more than once. And the reason I've read it a number of times is it really helped my own marriage, but also gave me training tools to help leaders have healthy conversations. I do a lot of training with leaders. My website is growahealthychurch.com. And my podcast show is Build a Leadership Pipeline, which gives church leaders a step-by-step process to grow more leaders in their church.
Thank you, John. The only thing that's going to be bad about this episode is my Goodreads page is going to double. And just a reminder, everything that we mentioned today, you can find at schoolofpodcasting.com/937.
Hi, Dave. This is York from Welcome to Earth Stories. I was thinking about a book that will impress you. I was thinking about some scholarly books that I've read, but then I just kept on going back to a much simpler book. I know that there's podcasters that they're going to give you some mesmerizing books that's so compelling that you have to go out and read. The book that I'm going to mention, people may scoff at it and laugh, but I think it's one of the best books. It's called The Giving Tree. It's a children's book. I read this book to my son when he was a child. This book was written in 1964 by Shel Silverstein. It follows a relationship between an apple tree and a boy. The tree just keeps on giving, hence the name The Giving Tree. So when the boy grew up as a teenager and he wanted to make some money, the tree gave him some apples so that he could sell. And when the boy became middle-aged, the tree gave him some wood so he could build for himself a boat. And then later on, when he becomes a much older man, the tree keeps on giving him more of her resources so that he could build a house. And when the boy eventually becomes an old man, he returns to the tree. But the tree doesn't have any leaves, doesn't have any apples. is just a stump. The tree tells the boy that she doesn't have any apples. She doesn't have any more materials like in the past. But the boy, who's an old man at this time, says, "All I want is a quiet place to sit and rest," which the tree, who was weak at the time, could provide. It's a picture about selflessness, about unconditional love. And that story remains with me to this day. So whenever I turn on the microphone, or whenever I edit my podcast and other people's podcast, I'm always thinking, am I the giving tree? Am I giving it my all? And when I feel that I'm not giving it my all, I rewrite my stories, or I go through the editing process and make sure that the person that's going to listen to the episode is going to be amazed. I think we all need to give our very best, and that's what the Giving Tree taught me. If you want to check out my show, Welcome to Earth Stories, we just started our 7th season. I've been producing this show since 2017, and the show is getting better and better. These are sci-fi stories. So if you're a sci-fi fan or a Twilight Zone fan, then you're right at home. You could go on my website, welcometoearthstories.com. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you, York. I love my audience. I really do. And I have not heard these suggestions. I'm hearing them for the first time with you. And that sounds like an amazing book that I want to read myself and then pretty much give to every kid I know.
Hey, Dave. It's Mark Lawley. And a book that I've reread a number of times is The Success Principles by Jack Canfield. I enjoy it so much, and I've learned so much from it. There is a 38-page section of this book that I read at least once per year. It's about, as the title says, the success principles, the principles that will help you get from where you are to where you want to be. And it deals with staying motivated, setting goals and how to reach those goals, how to manage our time. And that particular section of the book that I reread all the time not only deals with that goal setting, but how to lay out your day, how to accomplish what you want to accomplish, and to visualize the completion of your goal. Again, the book is The Success Principles by Jack Canfield, and I highly recommend the book. My name is Mark Lawley. We host the Practical Prepping Podcast. You can find our website at practicalprepping.info, and we teach people how to stay prepared for the things that will normally happen. We're in hurricane season right now, and today I'm working on hurricane preparedness episode. Again, it's Practical Prepping Podcast, practicalprepping.info.
Thank you, Mark. I believe I have that one in my Audible library. And if you are unfamiliar with the name Jack Canfield, he's the Chicken Soup for the Soul guy.
Hello, this is Mike on the mic from the 70s versus the 80s podcast. And a book I have read more than once is Born to Run. No, it's not the book about that New Jersey rock and roll guy. It's a book about learning to run barefoot. The reason I love this book so much is because I love books about people that push themselves to the limits and kind of color outside the lines a little bit. Plus, this book was hilarious. It had a bunch of stories about people drinking their own urine. It had a great history lesson about the Taramua Indians in central Mexico. And of course, like I said, it was very inspiring. In fact, I was so inspired by the book, I actually ran a full marathon barefoot myself 2 years ago. And yes, I did say ouch a lot. And not only did I read this book twice, I also read Born to Run and Born to Run back to back. But it was another book of the same name, Born to Run by, yes, Bruce Springsteen. I guess people on Amazon keep ordering the wrong book when they try to order one or the other. But you can't go wrong. Both books are excellent. And speaking of Bruce Springsteen, we do talk about him a lot on the 70s versus the 80s podcast. And on the 70s versus the 80s, we're not afraid to form our opinions. Now, if you want to have an opinion about politics or religion, you can listen to the other podcast, because we're more concerned with the important topics like who was a better superhero, Lou Ferrigno or Christopher Reeve, Star Wars or Star Trek, and why does everybody remember Hubba Bubba when Bubble Yum had a far superior taste? Who did it best, Bo and Luke Duke or Coy and Vance Duke? I don't even remember those guys, really. Station wagons or minivans? And who did it worse, New Coke or Crystal Pepsi? Well, I kind of think you get the idea. So yes, we only talk about the really important things like retro pop culture. The 70s versus the 80s is available everywhere. And Dave, I'm sorry, you're going to have to remind me which episode you talked about making an inexpensive homepage because we still don't have a homepage yet. Help! Keep it classy, my fellow retro pop culture loving babies. This has been Wolfman Mike on the mic.
Wolfman Mike! Yeah! The Wolfman, baby! Dude, you know I love you. I appreciate your answer. But when you say find me wherever you find podcasts, that's a almost, I wouldn't say it's a certain recipe for disaster, but I'm just here to tell you, as someone who works in support, it's hard to find a podcast in some of these apps. Whereas if you said, go to 70v80.com, right there, and then you can have a link to Apple and Google and Spotify. Go over to yourpodcastwebsite.com and start from episode 1. You can use something like Podpage to build a website in less than about 10 minutes with no coding. And here's the other thing, with the way Google, all right, we'll hit the jingle again.
Oh no, here we go. It's time for a 10-second tangent. Dave's going to fly off on another subject that isn't really related to what we're talking about. 10-second my ass. Rubbish.
With Google now doing all sorts of AI stuff, I don't know about you. I said it in my last episode, I've switched to Bing because the front page of Google is just a nightmare. And they're putting answers on the front page instead of here's a link where you can get the answer. And so I've heard people, my buddy Colin Gray over at the podcast host said his traffic is down. And so if you're not going to be coming up in Google searches, there are some people like, well, then why have a website? Because that means for people to find you, you have to tell them where to go. Schoolofpodcasting.com, because it may not come up in a search. And when they are telling somebody about how cool your podcast is, and somebody goes, where can I find that? They can go over at, powerofpodcasting.com, whatever your website is, you want to be able to tell people where to go. Back to the books.
Hi, Dave. It's Craig from Live Well and Flourish, which is available at livewellandflourish.com. My answer to the question of the month might be a little odd, but the book that I find myself reading over and over again is Seneca's Letters from a Stoic. This was came out thousands of years ago, and it's truly timeless. It helps me remember kind of what's important in life and the fact that some things are under our control and some things aren't. So you have to control what you can and let the rest go. And there are a lot of other little reminders about everything from just how to handle daily problems to how to handle grief. If you needed any kind of life advice about almost anything, you can find the answers there. And so I find myself reading it at least a couple of times a year, and often just going back to it and looking up specific letters to get insights on particular problems. It's also an endless supply of ideas for my podcast, since my podcast deals with how to live an excellent life. Again, this is Craig from Live Well and Flourish, which is available at livewellandflourish.com. And Dave, thanks for everything you do for the podcasting community.
Thank you, Craig. And he's proven my point. Sometimes you can get ideas for your podcast by going through a book.
Hi, Dave and School of Podcasts listeners. This is Mark DeCote from podcastbranding.co, where I help podcasters get noticed through professionally designed visual branding. And from resourcefuldesigner.com, where I help graphic designers start, run, and grow their own design business. Now, unfortunately, Dave, I don't think you're going to benefit too much from my answer this month, as I have 2 books that I consume every year. I say consume because I either read the physical books or listen to the audiobooks. And those 2 books are Platform, Get Noticed in a Noisy World by Michael Hyatt, and Building a Story Brand by Donald Miller. 2 books that you're already very familiar with. Out of the 2, I do believe Platform is the most beneficial for your listeners, Dave, as it truly speaks to people who are trying to get some sort of message out via podcasts, videos, or whatever. And as a podcaster for well over a decade now, I know that every year when I reread that book, there's some nugget of knowledge that I will have forgotten or just needed to be reinforced on. And that's why I keep going back to it. So thank you very much for this question, Dave. It just reminded me that it's, once again, time to, I was going to say dust off the audiobooks, but I don't know if that's how it works. But it is time to add them back to my queue for another go-around. Once again, Mark DeCote from podcastbranding.co. Thanks, Dave.
Yes, those are two books definitely worth reading. Like I said, right now I'm reading Donald Miller's new book. And if you want your stuff to look good, there's only one place to go, podcastbranding.co. And I say that because Mark has done the School of Podcasting, Ask the Podcast Coach, Podcast Rodeo Show. He's done your podcast website and my newest one, Podcast Hot Seat. So if he sucked, I wouldn't go back 4 other times. He's really good. Podcastbranding.co.
Hey, Dave, it's Ralph from the Ask Ralph Show, your podcast for Christian finance. The book I like to read at least once a year is a Dale Carnegie book, and it's called How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's a book that's really made a huge impact on my life. And I'm going to tell you, if you're a podcaster, it's a book you should really read because it's going to give you some great ideas of how to connect with your audience. So for this month, the book I'm reading is How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's one that I would highly suggest. I'd also suggest my show, which is AskRalphPodcast.com. Again, that's AskRalphPodcast.com. We do a show on Christian finance and how to bring those two worlds together, both faith and finance. Thanks, Dave. I appreciate everything you do.
Thank you, Ralph. And I want to point out something that Ralph is doing, which is really cool. Ralph has a book. It's called Mastering Your Finances, a comprehensive guide to creating a personal finance plan. And Ralph has like 30 years in basically personal finance, and he's giving away the book. If you go over to AskRalphPodcast.com and sign up for his newsletter, you can get a copy of this book. And the beauty of this book is it's not like War and Peace, but he's packed a ton of stuff into it. So again, if you want to check it out, go over to AskRalphPodcast.com and sign up for his newsletter to get a copy of the book, Mastering Your Finances, a comprehensive guide to creating a personal finance plan. Thank you, Ralph. That's very nice of you. And as we're doing book promotion, I should mention, I read my book about 5 times, probably more than that when I wrote it. You can find that at profitfromyourpodcast.com. But my favorite books that I read more than once is the one that Mark talked about, Platform, Get Noticed in a Noisy World by Michael Hyatt. This is one of those that if you've ever heard like a coach say, sometimes you just got to go back to the basics. That's a great one that just goes, oh yeah, that's what good content is. And then the other one is Storyworthy. And this is from Matthew Dix. And there are so many books that are like, you should use stories. Stories are good. Yeah, stories are good. And this is how to tell a story. This will help you when you're editing your interviews to get the stuff out that you don't need when you're like, so tell me, when did you know you wanted to be a race car driver? And they're like, my great grandpa was like, no, we don't need to go that far back. Like, easy. Storyworthy is another book that I read more than once. And as Mark brought it up, I'm reading right now Donald Miller's Coach Builder, and I might go back and read StoryBrand. As I was looking around for this, I actually signed up for Don Miller has a course on StoryBrand, and I was like, I need to go through that content because sometimes, it makes sense, it inspires us, but as Mark pointed out, you go along and life happens and you forget this stuff, and you go back and you go, oh yeah. So Storyworthy and Platform are 2 that I read on a regular basis. Thanks to everyone who sent that in. I'll have links to everybody's website and to all their books out at schoolofpodcasting.com/937. In just a second, what does the original Planet of the Apes have to do with podcast advertising? The show I Think Not, which is apparent in this, is instructing their audience to do what some may feel is fraud. Now, keep in mind that when you do a podcast, sure, everyone can hear it, but that includes your sponsors. And so when you're telling your audience, hey, just download a bunch of episodes because Apple Podcasts has made our stats more accurate and I'm not making as much money, And so this is from the Podcasting 2.0 show. They had this clip, and I'm going to replay it here. Here is a lovely woman named Ellen Marsh.
And if you are on Apple Podcasts, I want to tell you there was an iOS update that is making all podcasters bend over, grab our ankles, and take it up the. If you are on Apple Podcasts and you go to our page, please click the 3 dots in the top right-hand corner, go to settings, and just click automatically download 10 latest episodes. Just that will fix the iOS update that has fucked all of the podcasters.
And so when you're just download 10, you don't have to listen to them. Back on episode 915, I talked about these companies now that if you hear anybody like, we'll set up a landing page for you with our own player and drive traffic to that, that's a red flag. You have to ask them, is this a verified download, which typically is kind of spammy because it's happening behind the scenes, or a verified listen? Ask them that, because what's going to happen is here we go, people doing naughty things, all in the pursuit of getting more money. And if you've never seen, this is a movie before my time, the 1968 original version of the Planet of the Apes has this iconic scene at the end, but I kind of feel like if these people, your sponsor's going to hear that and go, wait a minute, what? And then, you know what? Someday I just feel like I'm going to walk along and there's going to be all these dead podcasts and I'm just going to be like Charlton Heston.
You maniacs! You blew it up! Oh, damn you! Damn you all to hell!
I have said it many times and I will repeat it here. When you start a podcast, every podcaster starts with the same 2 things: no audience and integrity. And I don't care if it's taking a, quote, personal story that was written by ChatGPT or inflating your numbers in a way to get more sponsorship dollars. Realize that sponsor is going to pay, but they're not going to get the results they expect because, well, your numbers have been artificially inflated and you're just going to blow the whole thing up.
You blew it up!
And speaking of blowing things up, Spotify has now given you the, if you could put up quotation marks for me, feature of taking your audio podcast on Spotify. You log into your Spotify dashboard and you can say, hey, take this audio file and replace it with this video file. And when you do that, when it was an audio file from your media host, be it Captivate, Libsyn, Buzzsprout, Blueberry, whoever, those stats go back into your one dashboard where you can see where your file was downloaded and played on every app. Well, if you go into Spotify and say, hey, turn this audio file into a video file, I've got the video file right here, those stats of people playing the video file are only going to appear in Spotify, which means now when you want to check your stats, you have to go into your media host and then you have to go into Spotify. This is very much like YouTube, which, speaking of YouTube, if you actually want to get somebody to watch that video, I would strongly suggest uploading it to YouTube. I have about 14 episodes on Spotify as video, and I'll explain how I got those there in a second. It wasn't the, hey, let's take my audio podcast and abracadabra, it's now video. Because A, isn't that going to kind of cheese off your audience? They're expecting some audio file, and all of a sudden this giant 2 gigabyte file shows up. They're like, hey, wait, what? But I have a bunch of files on Spotify. They've been there for a year, and I believe it's either 13 or 14 files, and I have 7 views of those files, of which I'm almost 100% sure 4 of those are me. And so if you're like, oh, I'm going to put it on Spotify and get a ton of views now, again, your mileage may vary, but I'm just saying if somebody says, hey, did you see that weird clown fight in the street? I'm going to YouTube to see that. I'm not going to go to Spotify. If I want to hear a new single from one of my favorite bands, I'm going to Spotify. So I just want to point that out. So if you're like, no, Dave, I want to try this out myself. if you want video on Spotify, then go to, Spotify for podcasters and set up a separate show. I talked about this back on episode 923. And when you make a video podcast, let's rename that a video Spotify podcast or a Spotify video podcast. You get the idea. It's only going to Spotify. That's it. The video will only be seen on Spotify. So keep that in mind. It's something they rolled out as, again, quotation marks, a feature, but in the end, you end up cutting your stats off for that episode in your media host. I really don't recommend that you do that. If you are a Streamyard user, and I always say, for me, I'm on a Mac, so I run Ecamm to do my live streaming, but I used Streamyard for years. It's a great program, and unfortunately, that company was bought years ago by a company called Hopin. Well, Hopin was bought, so hence Streamyard was bought by a company that has laid off now 40 plus software engineers. So what this means is not that Streamyard is going away, but it's probably not going to get any better. It's a company, Bending Spoons, and they are basically the same people that bought Evernote and then kind of messed it up and then raised the price. So there's a chance this may be happening to Streamyard. We'll have to see. I don't want to make anybody panic, but just say you might want to just keep your eye open. I know some people like Riverside. During the Ask the Podcast Coach this week, somebody pointed out Evu Mux. I'll have a link to that out in the show notes. And it's, again, another streaming service. And I just wanted to let you know that, hey, if you're on StreamYard, again, nothing may change at all for a while. But I can also tell you, it sure looks like that software is not going to get any better. What you got now is what you're going to stay with.
In case you missed it, it's time for a podcast rewind.
What's up, everybody? John Lee Dumas of Entrepreneurs on Fire here, and Dave Jackson rocked the mic on EO Fire about why every entrepreneur should have a podcast. So get your little booties over to EO Fire. Listen to the show. It was amazing.
That is my second appearance on Entrepreneurs on Fire. JLD and I go back a ways. I remember when he first started, and I thought, that guy's crazy. He's going to do a daily show. And he's an amazing dude, super disciplined to be able to pull that off. And I'll have links to that again out at schoolofpodcasting.com/937. Last little bit of housekeeping. I told you I would keep abreast of this when I started the Your Podcast website show. The first episode after 30 days got a whopping, he just had this number. Just a little more housekeeping. When I launched the Your Podcast website show, I told you I would keep you kind of abreast of its growth. So the first episode after 30 days had 59 downloads, and I just checked one from not too long ago, and it has now got 75 downloads after 30 days. And if you do the percentage on that, that is a 27% growth. And so that sounds amazing. But number-wise, it's like, I'm not even up to 100 yet. But realize sometimes, again, if you're a company and they go, we can grow the company by 27%, you should do that. And we kind of get lost in the numbers. It's only 16 more, but it's still 75 people that could be listening to the radio, playing Xbox, playing anything, watching Amazon, watching Hulu, whatever. It's going in the right direction. And this is why I often say it takes years to build an audience. So keep that in mind. I told you I would keep you abrupt on that, and I'll occasionally report back on that as we move forward. But moving forward, if you'd like to start or grow your podcast, I would love to help you. It's what I do. Go over to schoolofpodcasting.com, use the coupon code LISTENER, and save on either a monthly or yearly subscription. And don't forget that comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee. If you just want to hire me for consulting, I do that too, but I'm here to tell you, You get unlimited consulting when you join for a month. So sign up for a month, pull everything you can out of my head, and then cancel your subscription. It's just a way to do that if that's what you want to do. So thank you so much for listening. I will see you again with another episode of the School of Podcasting. Until then, take care. God bless. Class is dismissed.